let's talk about the money in your bank account, the cash you've worked hard to save up. Do you ever stop and wonder, is it actually safe? Is it stable? What if I told you that the very foundation of that money has been quietly, systematically changed for over 100 years? 96%. That's how much purchasing power the US dollar has lost since the Federal Reserve was created back in 1913. Just let that number sink in for a moment. 96%. Almost all of its real value has just vanished into thin air. And here's what that actually looks like in real life. You see this basket of goods that would have cost you $100 in 1913? Well, in 2023, that same basket would set you back almost $3,100. Now, this isn't some story about a sudden dramatic crash. No, it's about a slow, silent, almost invisible process that plays out over a lifetime. So, how on earth did this happen? What were the moments that literally changed the rules of money forever? Well, it really all goes back to a single decision, one moment in history when the fundamental nature of our money was completely rewritten, pretty much overnight. And you know what? Most people barely even noticed it was happening. You see, before 1971, the US dollar had what you could call a golden anchor. Every single dollar was backed by a fixed amount of physical gold held by the government. This was huge because it put a hard limit on how much money could ever be created. But after 1971, that anchor was cut loose. The dollar became what's known as a fiat currency, which is just a fancy way of saying it's backed only by faith in the government. The physical limit on creating money, it was gone. And it all went down incredibly fast. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, basically severing that tie between the dollar and gold. They tried to patch things up a few months later, but it didn't work. By March of 73, the whole system of fixed exchange rates that had governed the world since World War II was just abandoned. In less than 2 years, the entire global monetary system was turned upside down. So what happens when you just rewrite the rules of money like that? What did it actually feel like for the average person whose life savings were suddenly floating without an anchor? Well, this was the official story. The promise made to the American public on the exact day the change was made. A promise of stability. A promise that, well, it was about to be completely shattered. Because the reality was anything but stable. What came next was a period we now call the Great Inflation. Prices didn't just creep up, they exploded. Twice in one decade, the annual inflation rate soared into the double digits, at one point peaking at nearly 15%. And a brand new, ugly word entered the dictionary: stagflation. It was this toxic economic nightmare that experts used to think was impossible. You had high unemployment at the exact same time that prices were just spiraling out of control. For anyone holding on to cash, their savings were being systematically wiped out. Now fast forward a few decades. Another crisis hits the global economy. But this time, the response was going to be even more extreme. The old tools just weren't going to cut it, so a completely new playbook had to be invented, right on the fly. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve had already cut interest rates to zero, and it still wasn't enough. So they turned to this new, incredibly powerful tool, quantitative easing, or QE. Put simply, this just meant the Fed started creating new money out of thin air to buy up assets like government bonds. The whole idea was to pump cash directly into the system to force borrowing costs even lower. And this is a huge point. The 2008 crisis didn't just lead to a bailout. It fundamentally rewired the entire monetary system. Before '08, the Fed ran what's called a scarce reserve system, where they'd carefully manage a pretty small amount of money. But after '08, they flipped to an ample reserve system, basically flooding the market with trillions in new money. The rules had changed, again, and this time the scale was just breathtaking. And here's what that scale looks like. Before 2008, the Fed's balance sheet was less than $1 trillion. After all the rounds of QE, it had ballooned to $4.5 trillion. That's an absolutely unprecedented expansion of the money supply, and it was all created with just a few keystrokes. You know, once a new playbook gets written, it's almost a guarantee it's going to be used again. The tools and the tactics that were developed to fight the 2008 crisis, well, they were about to be rolled out again on a scale that would make that previous crisis look almost small. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed's balance sheet didn't just grow, it doubled. From an already mind-boggling $4.5 trillion, it soared to a peak of $9 trillion by 2022. And all of this new money, combined with massive government stimulus,
had a very direct, very predictable effect. The amount of money in the system just exploded. And what happened next? Well, by January 2022, a key measure of inflation hit its highest level in 40 years. It's the same pattern we saw in the 1970s, just echoing into our own time. A radical change to the monetary system, followed by a dramatic loss of purchasing power for everybody.
Okay, so what does all this history actually mean for you, for the money you're trying to save and build a future with? What is the real story of how a currency loses its value? The most critical thing to understand is this. Your money's value doesn't just disappear overnight in some big dramatic event you see on the news. It's something much quieter and honestly, much more dangerous. Instead of one big collapse, it's a process. It happens in stages. Back in 1971, the rules were changed to solve a currency crisis. In 2008, the rules were changed again to solve a financial crisis. Each and every time, the system was altered to deal with an emergency, and each time, it came with long-term consequences. And with every single one of those changes, with every new playbook they rolled out, the foundation of your money was quietly chipped away. It's not a loud explosion. It's a slow, silent erosion. It happens crisis by crisis, rule change by rule change, decade by decade, until one day you just wake up and realize that the dollar you worked so hard to save just isn't the same dollar you earned. This history shows us a clear pattern. The very definition of money, how it's made, what backs it, has been changed multiple times to deal with national emergencies. And that leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about. If the rules of money have been rewritten so many times before, what makes you so sure they won't be rewritten again?